5. A children's army. They were running together, a pack of them, their feet hitting the ground in perfect synchrony, first 24 right feet, then 24 left. All dressed in gray, one behind the other, they seemed like a single creature, a giant caterpillar or a centipede. The orderly motion frightened Dodi. These people moved like an army, he thought. What terrified him most was the quiet. Their feet struck with a steady rhythm on the spongy earth, but the sound was muted like a heartbeat, more felt than heard. And not one of the running figures cried out to the newcomers who had emerged from the landing craft either to greet them or to warn them of a coming battle. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned off, except that the missing noise rang loud in Dodi's imaginings. He wanted to turn around and run back to the lander, where he and Elaine could have barricaded themselves in while trying to persuade Mickey to start up the engines and let them take off again. The craft was only a short distance away. But Bobby was outside somewhere, and they couldn't leave him behind. As the crowd of runners came closer with catch step, Dodi saw that they wore the same space agency coveralls that everyone on board the Wanderer wore. They looked like space travelers who had come from Earth in the first migration. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. He noticed something else as the runners moved closer and closer. These were not full-sized people at all. They were children, most of them smaller than his sister, Elaine. Well, maybe they are munchkins, Elaine said with some relief. But to Dodi, tall as he was, they seemed huge. Several looked bigger and older than he would have been if he had not awakened before he was supposed to. They were about the size of the big kids who bullied him on the school playground, as big as the blonde boy back home who had bloodied his nose once. And there were so many of them. Dodi's legs felt frozen. He looked for Bobby, hoping that his brother would rescue them. There wasn't a trace of him to be seen. By squinting as he scanned the horizon, Dodi could see that the craft had landed on a vast, almost featureless plain. There were no trees and no noticeable boulders or even rocks, just faintly green ground. The surface was smooth except for crusty places here and there, lime peel-colored scars and scabs raised up slightly on ground that was otherwise as smooth as a baby's skin. A pale green baby, the color of the inside of a ripe avocado. There was no obvious place for Bobby to hide except for a few dark round spots that might be holes in the ground or entrances to burrows. And there was no sign of a spaceship or lander from the first wave of travelers who had headed here so many years before. Where was the beacon that had called them to this very spot? Dodi wondered. As he looked around, he noticed that the lander rested on a cup of land with a puckered edge. The craft sat unevenly in this crater, tilting to one side even more than when they had left it. Dodi and Elaine found themselves backing up a little as the army of running children advanced. For all the energy of their movement, their legs were churning like pistons on a locomotive. The runners were making rather slow progress. The children seemed to be clutching swords, but the weapons did not gleam as real ones might be expected to in the bright daylight. Toy swords for a children's army, Dodi thought. But even that didn't comfort him. The runners drew their swords as they approached and began waving the weapons above their heads the way Saracens might have swirled their scimitars around and around to frighten off the Crusaders, or the way Visigoths might have charged the Roman legions. Dodi began moving backward in earnest at the curious sight of a horde of children acting like barbarians on a rampage, but he stopped when he saw that Elaine stood her ground. "What do we do now?" Dodi asked. "I vote we run for it." "Don't act like such a baby," Elaine said. "They're just a bunch of kids." Dodi knew she was right, but he still felt uneasy. "Hi, kids," Elaine shouted in a voice as loud as a police siren. The words had an unaccountable effect on the charging children, for all at once they stopped. "Hi, kids," Elaine repeated, in a more normal voice. There was no need to shout. The frozen forms were nearer to her than the length of a bowling lane. If she'd had a ball, she might have knocked them down like so many pins. One boy stepped forward from the group. He was slightly taller than the rest, a little taller than Elaine, but still more than a head shorter than Dodi. His hair was so thick and curly that he might have been a Ramsay cousin. He had skin that was almost paper white. Maybe that was what seemed so strange about these children. They should all have been lobster red or brown as walnut shells from playing in the intense sunlight of Planet 5. There wasn't a tint or a freckle among them. The boy was smiling. His white teeth, which were 35 straight and evenly spaced as any orthodontist could have made them, gleamed in the midday light. "Aren't you afraid of us?" he asked, running the sounds together so that it sounded like a single word. "Aren't you afraid of us?" "You speak English?" Dodie almost shouted. "What did you think we'd speak?" The boy said, but the way he said it could have been spelled "would ya think we'd speak." It should have been comforting to hear his own language spoken much the way it was back home in California. But Dodie was still ill at ease. "I never thought about it," Dodie said, and the tall boy and all the other children began to laugh. "That's a funny one," said a girl with golden hair. "The big girl spoke to us in English and now you're surprised that we speak English back." They all laughed again, but Dodie did not see the joke. "You didn't answer my question," the boy said. "Aren't you afraid of us?" Dodie carefully weighed what his response ought to be. If he denied that he was afraid, the army of children might decide to do something to show how fearsome they could be. But if he admitted to his fear, there was no telling what they might do to prove that he was right. He opened his mouth, ready to say that he was afraid, only to change his mind, shake his head and begin to declare that he wasn't frightened at all. It was not just fear that paralyzed him, although it was safe to say that Dodie was frightened. But in all the time he had lived alone on the Wanderer, he never had to settle an argument, never quarreled with anyone and never had to fight for his beliefs. He had grown old without anyone to clash with. Now he wanted only to live peacefully within his own family, and to please everyone and anger no one. So he stood there like a doddering old hermit, unable to speak. But Elaine didn't share his indecision. "Why should we be afraid of a bunch of little pipsqueaks like you?" she said. "Then you aren't even a little afraid?" the boy asked. He was disappointed. "That first one was afraid," said the girl with the golden hair. "It was funny the way he ran away so fast, wasn't it, Jonathan?" "We scared him good," said the tall boy proudly. "But we wanted to catch him and take him to the Budding Grove." "What's the Budding Grove?" Elaine asked. "You'll see," said Jonathan. "We're going to take you there." "Not unless we want to go," Elaine said. "I guess you're from Earth," said the boy. "Sure," said Elaine. "Aren't you?" "No, but I think I'd like it there." "Isn't it warm there?" "In California it's warm most of the time," Elaine said. "And it's wet too, isn't it?" "Parts are very wet," said Elaine. "It's warm then and wet," Jonathan said. "I could tell by the look of you that it was warm and wet." "Now I know I'd really like it there." "Were you born here?" Dodie asked. All the children laughed. "None of us were born here," Jonathan said. "We weren't born anywhere." "They must have hatched," Elaine said to Dodie. "Not hatched either," said Jonathan. "We're from the Budding Grove. You'll see when we take you." Dodie didn't like the sound of that. He didn't want to be taken anywhere by these children if they were children. There was something very different and very wrong about Jonathan and the others. They were just too perfect. For all their running about in the sun, they showed no signs of dirt or grime, no droplets of sweat ran down their foreheads or dampened their hair. No mud or dust soiled their coveralls. They were clean as newly washed white china. They were teacup clean, like no children Dodie could remember from his own distant days back home. They weren't people. Dodie suddenly realized they weren't born because they weren't people, but something else, even though they looked like people. "Which way did Bobby go?" Elaine now asked, her anger rising. "Where did you chase our brother?" "That other one, you mean?" Jonathan said. "By now, he's probably been caught and taken to the Budding Grove." The boy stepped toward Elaine, playfully pointing his sword at her. "We're going to take you there too." "No way," said Elaine as she rushed up to Jonathan and easily knocked him down. His sword fell to the ground noiselessly, without even a clatter. She sat on the boy's heaving chest and pinned his arms to the ground with her knees. Totally at her mercy, he could only squirm in discomfort. She had taken him by surprise, but the advantage lasted only a minute or so. The rest of the crew soon rushed to the aid of their fallen comrade. Dodie stood frozen, arguing with himself again. He could not decide whether it was better to join Elaine in a hopeless fight or run for the lander while she served as a distraction. "I'm just a little kid," he thought. Elaine won't expect me to help her. But then he reminded himself that he wasn't a kid anymore and that he ought to try to rescue his sister. At first, Elaine seemed to have no difficulty taking very good care of herself. Still sitting on Jonathan, she was able to knock down one child after another, with ease, as they charged up to her. But they wouldn't stay down, and soon they surrounded her and began wrapping her in lengths of string that all of them carried looped over their shoulders. One length of string would not have helped her, but 20 such loops all at once had her tied up in a tangle. She twisted and turned to pull herself free, but she could not hold them off for long by herself. "Dodie! Help me!" Dodie could stand still no longer. Without thinking, he rushed into the tornado of little people who were racing around his sister and began to knock them away. How light they seemed, as if they were made of bamboo or balsa wood, stuff far less substantial than muscle and bone. They began tossing lariats of string at him. The strands were made of a substance as sticky as a spider's thread but much thicker and very difficult to break. The string clung to him like chewing gum. His every movement was slowed by its grip. Out of anger, he picked up Jonathan's fallen sword and soon he was batting children away with the toy weapon. Sword struck sword in a satisfying whack. Oh, but he was happy for a minute or two. He felt as if he were young again. He had become Robin Hood, a knight of the Round Table, and a musketeer, all in one, fighting against impossible odds. "Take that," he said aloud as his sword slapped against one of the children. "Take that, and that," he said, just like a character in a movie or a book. But the army of children seemed to be enjoying the battle too, and they did not give up. They soon surrounded him and struck at him from all sides. He swung his sword until his arms ached. Still, he might have won the battle single-handedly except for one rather disturbing accident. Jonathan had snuck up on him from behind and kept poking him with the tip of a sword he'd taken from another boy. It was not painful, but very bothersome to Dodie, who turned around to fight off Jonathan face to face. He swung wildly, hitting the boy in the arm with all his strength. Dodie's weapon was a mere toy, a piece of blunt wood, not a sharpened edge of metal. But the sword sliced through Jonathan's arm, like a knife carving through a joint of turkey. The blow sent half the boy's arm flying across the field of battle. Dodie was stunned at the sight of the severed limb. It lay on the ground, rotting, the hand clutching at the air as if trying to recover its sword. Elaine continued to fight on, but Dodie dropped his own toy weapon and stood in shock as the boys and girls of the child's army tied him up snugly with their string lariats, loop after loop, so that Dodie was wound up in the sticky stuff. He couldn't move now if he'd wanted to. He stared at the severed arm, which continued to twitch with life. The children were free to gang up on Elaine, and they soon had her wrapped up in her own cocoon of string. "I'm so sorry," Dodie bleated as 48 or so hands, more or less, lifted them into the air. The army was going to carry the two of them away. "So very, very sorry," Dodie muttered as he managed to catch a look at Jonathan. To Dodie's surprise, the boy appeared to be in no agony at all. In fact, he was smiling. No blood spurted from the stump of arm that the swipe of the wooden blade had left behind. "He deserved it," Elaine said, trying to console her brother. "You gave the creep just what he was asking for." "But I didn't mean to hurt him," Dodie said. As if in response, the army of children stopped and placed Dodie and Elaine on their feet on the ground. They stood side by side, unable to move arms or legs, like a pair of statues in a sculpture garden. "I didn't mean to hurt anybody." "Of course you meant to or you wouldn't have been fighting," said one of the girls. "That's the fun of playing army. Once I whacked Roger's head off, and another time I lost 3 whole fingers from my left hand." Dodie knew she was lying, because he could see that both her hands had all their fingers. "Why be sorry?" Jonathan said. "I'd have done the same to you if you gave me the chance. It's just an arm." "Aren't you in pain?" Elaine asked. "I know the word, but I'm not sure I know what it means," Jonathan said. "Besides, there's no real harm." He reached down to pick up the arm. He turned around, holding the arm up like a trophy for everyone to see. Dodie was so horrified that he wanted to close his eyes, but the children applauded. Then Jonathan pushed the 2 cut ends of his severed arm together and held them there for a few seconds before he let go as good as new. Jonathan said, snapping the fingers at the end of the restored arm to make the point. Dodie was relieved. He began to see Jonathan in a new light. The boy was forgiving, almost kindly, as pleasant and agreeable as he was peculiar. The other children laughed and shouted. "They are Munchkins," Elaine whispered to Dodie. "How did he do that?" asked Dodie. "You're very strange," Jonathan said. "Not strange," said the girl with golden hair. "Stupid." "Not stupid," said Jonathan. "Ignorant." "Ignorant?" objected Elaine. "If I could move my hands, I'd give you a beating you wouldn't forget." "And definitely ill-tempered," said the boy. "I'm not ill-tempered," Elaine insisted. Dodie knew he was right. Ignorant he certainly was, and ill-tempered as well. The same could be said of his sister. After all, she was the one who struck the first blow, and what had the children done in response except defend themselves? Dodie felt shame at his own actions. And he might have said so in an attempt to make peace between the visitors from the planet Earth and these residents of Planet 5, but then the ground on which they stood began quaking violently. Bound in a mass of sticky string, Dodie could not keep his balance and fell to the ground. He landed so hard on his stomach that the breath was knocked out of him for a minute. He looked up as the ground continued to shake and buck beneath him. Elaine was also flat on the ground. They were both bobbing up and down as the ground rolled and swelled. Dodie knew a lot about earthquakes and had lived through many of them in California, including one that knocked jars and plates and books from their shelves and made long cracks in the plaster. But this was stronger than any earthquake he'd experienced. The children's army managed to stay on its feet, which was about as difficult as it would be to stay standing on the back of a running horse. Then Dodie noticed what was happening to the landing craft. "Elaine!" he shouted. But there was no need to get her attention. She could see what was happening. The edges of the cup of ground that had held the landing craft rose up around it. The tilted craft tumbled down the rising surface of Planet 5 into what seemed like smacking lips. The crater had become a gigantic, yawning mouth, which engulfed and finally swallowed the lander entirely. As suddenly as the quaking had begun, the ground stilled. For several seconds there was silence, which was broken by the sound of Elaine, not just sniffling or sobbing, but bawling. "We'll never get home again. Never, ever." Dodie wanted to comfort her, to assure her that they would be rescued, returned to the spaceship Wanderer and their parents' keep, but he could not bring himself to say so. He was too forlorn himself to believe it. Well, at least he'd had a long life and had lived to see the sun again, even if it was not the same sun of his memories. But Elaine deserved more than this. He tried to turn his head to look at her, but the children were in the way now. In a respectful silence, the army of children again lifted Dodie and Elaine above their heads and began running so swiftly that Dodie could feel a rush of wind through his hair. "Where are we going?" Elaine shouted. "To the budding grove," Jonathan yelled back at her. "To the budding grove," called out the army of children.